I'm here to talk about open data sharing under the GDPR, and this is one of the subjects that we deal with quite a bit for TechGDPR, which is a boutique consultancy that I run in Berlin. We do actually only GDPR for deep tech. Now, one of the recent things that we worked on is a privacy report or a GDPR compliance report for a company called Zcash cryptocurrency, and I thought it was interesting to highlight. Also because that was last week featured on Forbes, something I'm slightly proud of. And the other thing that I'm involved in, and you may recognize this gentleman who happens to be the Secretary of State of this very ministry. So the other thing I'm involved in is Bearchain, is connecting blockchain companies in Berlin and promoting that outside of Berlin. And the interesting thing is, as Rutger mentioned this morning, that Raymond Knops was also at the Hackathon last year. So that kind of like completes the circle for me, and I thought it was worth mentioning. But of course, I'm here to talk about open data and data sharing under the GDPR. Now, the first thing that you should probably realize is that the regulators, with regard to GDPR, have a very almost extreme point of view. So the European Data Protection Supervisor said in 2017 that there might well be a market for personal data, just like there is tragically a market for live human organs, but it does not mean we can or should give that market the blessing of legislation. And I think that puts you in the right mindset, right? What is the whole thing about personal data, and should we be monetizing this? And also with the GDPR specifically, there are very harsh fines for violations of it. So just to recap, you probably all heard about this, but there's up to 20 million euro fine or 4% of your annual worldwide group turnover, whichever is higher. So for Google, that can definitely go up, and Google was fined 2 weeks ago with 50 million euros. But there are other aspects to it, and one of them is the mandatory disclosure, which can certainly harm your reputation, and you can also receive an order to stop processing data. And for a data company, that is a company death sentence. The GDPR is built on a number of basic principles: lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. You need to be handling data in a lawful way, in a fair way, in a transparent way, with a limited purpose. So it is no longer possible to just keep collecting data for whatever purpose and figure out what you do with it later, which was very popular a year, like 8 or 10 years ago. It's very important to only collect the data that you need for a specific purpose, so data minimization. It needs to be accurate data. You need to have a limitation on the storage period. You can't just keep it forever until you figure out what you want to do with it. And the data needs to be stored or processed under the principle of integrity and confidentiality. And you're going to be held accountable for it if you're collecting data, right? And the whole GDPR is a risk-based approach. That means there are no specific requirements such as use 256-bit encryption or store it for 3 years, but for every processing activity that you or a company involves in, they need to think about, okay, what is actually the risk of processing this data, and what technical and organizational measures such as encryption and a lock on the door do you actually use? So there's a lot of responsibility if you're processing data. The scope of the GDPR is data of natural persons within the EU. So this is people in the EU, not, which is a common misconception, residents or citizens of the EU, but it's really about people that are physically on European soil. It's about personal data, not anonymized data, and not about data for household use. So if you want to write your Christmas card, you can still do that. Right. But what I find interesting is to talk a little bit about the privacy and information asymmetry. So right now, if we're looking at the world, we have the corporations and the governments that holds a lot of data about us. And on the contrary, we as individuals or startups, we perhaps don't even know who the person is that is actually responsible for the company. So there's this big information asymmetry. They know a lot about us, but we don't know a lot about them. And open data makes it a lot better. So by sharing certain critical data points or information about what is actually going on in the world around you, you have a little bit more of an advantage over those big companies that have been working with data since ages. Basically, slightly balancing this scale and slightly making this world a better place. So I'm a big supporter of that, obviously. But then if you're sharing data, if you're looking at open data, eventually you'll end up with very large data sets. There's a lot of data, perhaps different government institutions share their data, and it is not so much about this one data set, right? But there may be a situation where there are 3 or 4 different data sets that could be combined, and you may be able to find behavioral patterns in such data. Again, perhaps between one data set, but also between other data sets, which is part of the difficulty, right? So how are you going to ensure that with the data that's being shared, there's actually no big risk of those combinations to be made, and therefore personal data surfacing from those data sets. And if you think about it, so when does something become personal data, right? And that's actually, I'm missing a slide here. Perhaps I'm not missing a slide. Anyway, example, if I go to the bakery as my routine every Friday morning, and I buy a bread with my payment card, a credit card, or a PIN pass, and then right afterwards, every Friday morning, I go to the cafe and I basically get a coffee and perhaps something else, right? I do that every Friday morning. And with those data points alone, without knowing who I am, it is possible to identify me by simply standing outside of the bakery and saying, okay, who is here consistently every Friday morning, and then walks in the direction of the cafe. So when does something become personal data? If you're able to single out one person, right? Another example, if perhaps I'm talking about someone who is a manager at KPN. There are probably hundreds of managers in a company like KPN, right? So that doesn't constitute personal data. But if I'm talking about the managing partner of TechGDPR, which is a fairly small company, there's only one of them, so that would then constitute personal data, just to put it in perspective. A personal data breach under the GDPR is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. So it's not only about information leaking out, right? It's also if it's accidentally destroyed, for example, or if it's accidentally altered, that's also considered a privacy breach or a personal data breach in the terminology of the GDPR. And then under breaches and notifications in the GDPR, it is if there's a risk to the freedom and the rights of a natural person, it is required to notify the authorities within 72 hours. And as a sideline, I didn't put this in the slide, after 72 hours of finding out, right? Just if you think about the challenge, this may be interesting. If there's a high risk to the privacy and the rights of an individual, you also need to notify the affected data subject. And this is actually one of those points where you really go against the risk of reputational damage. If the data was leaked of, I don't know, 80,000 visitors of a certain trade show, and you need to notify all of them that you haven't been careful with their data, will they come back the year after? So I think it's quite clear that open data should be anonymized, should be quite obvious. And if you want to learn more about anonymization versus pseudonymization, there's a link in here, but probably if you Google for WP216, you'll find it as well. This is the opinion of the Working Party 29, which was the former authorities of data protection in Europe, and they've written a 36-page document about anonymization versus pseudonymization. What it also indicates is that that barrier is very high. It is not very easy to truly anonymize data, because you may always have some of these data points left that can be recombined. And even though de-anonymization is very, very illegal and punishable with big fines under the GDPR, if you have the risk of this happening, you still want to be very, very careful with it. So a little bit about personal data and blockchain. I think one of the main things that you should think about, well, the right to erasure and rectification, which probably everyone, especially in the area of privacy and blockchain, has heard of, is very, very difficult on an immutable ledger. So to start with, I would really think about or basically ensure not to store any personal data on a blockchain directly. But if it's not personal data directly or unencrypted, then what about encrypted on-chain personal data? And also, that is where the GDPR or the regulators see encryption as a technical measure to protect data, but it's not a way of moving it out of scope of the GDPR. So this is still in scope of the GDPR. It still needs to be handled as personal data, and therefore you also need to be able to let people exercise this right to be forgotten, right? And encryption can be broken in the future, quantum computing is coming up, so all these kind of considerations, you don't want to have these kind of things on an immutable ledger. But what about hashes? That's one-way encryption. I don't think I have to explain this to this audience, but if there is a hash stored on the blockchain, that may also give some pointers to information and behavioral patterns. So for example, if I take my data from my passport, which is originally Dutch, not Latvian, but for the sake of example, take that and make a hash out of it and store that on the blockchain, the question is what's going to happen with that? Is that personal data? And the answer is yes, it is personal data, for the main reason that if someone would get my passport and the hashing algorithm, they could recreate this hash and therefore figure out my behavioral patterns on the blockchain, on an immutable ledger, where we don't want them. So then looking at the challenge, so what are some of the possible approaches to solving the challenge? And I know the challenge will be explained in more detail later, but I wanted to give you some food for thought about which direction you could think of, right? First of all, blockchain. It's not the easiest, and some things have been named already. I think self-sovereign identity is one of those points where you could definitely look at for certain solutions in this realm. If you think about immutable records and keeping log files, for example, of who has had access to certain data sets or who has dealt with certain algorithms, certainly interesting. You can give back control over one's own data using blockchain technology. You can enable marketplaces, look at Ocean Protocol, for example. Enable secure execution and rewarding people in a way that is not run with a central authority. I think that's one of the other opportunities of blockchain. Finding patterns, not specifically in blockchain, but if we look at data sets, we may want to have a look at, okay, which kind of pattern is actually something that is closely related to personal data or is with a high likeliness personal data. Looking at relationships as well, it's like, okay, what if we take multiple data sets and try to build relations between them? Will we be successful with that? And will that constitute or possibly constitute personal data? And one of the things to think about is also, perhaps from the data itself is very difficult, but if you try to map that onto the real world, it becomes a lot more interesting. If we look at GPS coordinates, is that personal data? Well, not per se. But if these GPS coordinates may resemble the movement patterns of a typical human being, then there's a high likeliness that they will be. In general, using blockchain technology, decentralizing information, splitting it up over different areas where there may be different parts living in different locations where you may need to do some extra effort or may not be able to do to basically link this back up, maybe another interesting approach to this challenge. And what I find very interesting personally is also synthesized data sets. So where basically a data set is being used as input for an algorithm that basically recreates a fake data set with the same characteristics as the original data set. This is something that I find extremely interesting as an approach, because for certain use cases this can well be used. This may definitely be a possibility. Zero knowledge proofs in general, proving that certain facts are true or not true without seeing the data, perhaps executed somewhere else, is something that I find interesting. And I like to close with a thought that is not mine, but Trent of Ocean Protocol, also in his talk that he did last Monday, said like, well, we don't want to bring the data to the AI, but we want to bring the AI to the data. That's it.
Thank you so much.
Good.